Ever had to confront someone older than you and stand your ground?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Because the toast that night was not about love, and it was not about celebrating my sister's engagement. It was the moment everything I had quietly carried for years finally reached the surface in front of people who never expected to see it. I walked into that party already knowing my role: stay quiet, smile when appropriate, and make sure nobody felt like I was competing with Hannah. My mother made sure to seal that expectation the second I hugged her at the door, leaning into my ear and whispering that I should not overshadow my sister tonight. I smiled and nodded because at this point it was routine, the same message I had been given since childhood, that Hannah needed the spotlight and I needed to keep out of the way. I told myself I could do it for one evening. After all, this was her engagement, not mine, and I had no reason to rock the boat. But as the drinks settled and conversations circled around the table, her fiancé, Mark, stood up to make a toast. At first, everyone expected the usual story about how they met or some sentimental promise for the future. Instead, he raised his glass, cleared his throat, and said he had something everyone needed to hear before they celebrated. You could feel the oxygen get sucked out of the room. Hannah's smile froze, and my mother's hand tightened on the napkin in her lap. Mark began talking about how he had been going over finances with Hannah while planning the wedding. He said there were some numbers that did not make sense, and out of respect for her and for the people in the room, he wanted to bring it to light. He was calm, deliberate, not accusatory, but firm. He mentioned deposits to vendors that never cleared and marketing expenses that turned out to be receipts for high-end clothing and spa days. He said there were donor funds listed as outreach gifts, but the delivery addresses were not community centers or scholarship programs. They were residential apartments. Every sentence hit like a hammer. I sat there quietly, watching Hannah's face shift from confusion to forced laughter and finally to something close to panic. My mother gave me a look that said, "Don't you dare," but inside I felt the years of swallowing my voice tighten into one single point. I could have stayed silent and let Mark handle it, but that would have meant letting Hannah spin it as a misunderstanding. I had seen these discrepancies months ago while helping her draft one of her nonprofit's quarterly reports. She brushed me off then, saying I was overthinking and that she had it handled. I knew she did not, and I had kept the emails to prove it. So I raised my hand a little, almost as if I was back in a classroom, and asked one question that sounded harmless but carried weight. Did the board approve those disbursements? The room went still. Hannah blinked hard, probably realizing in that second that I was not going to let her slide out of this. She stumbled through a vague answer about informal approvals, but I pressed lightly, keeping my tone steady. I said that when I helped with the quarterly report, I could not find the board minutes. In fact, I asked her for them twice, and she told me she was too busy to send them. The silence after that was heavy. Some of the donors sitting nearby exchanged glances. My father shifted in his seat, but said nothing. My mother whispered my name like she could reel me back in with one word, but it was too late. I leaned back in my chair, still calm, and added that if everything was above board, then surely she would be glad to know I had kept the email exchanges where she mentioned the missing minutes. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it was enough to let everyone know that this was not about a simple misunderstanding. Hannah's voice cracked when she tried to dismiss me. She said, "Emma, you don't know what you're talking about." And I simply looked at her and replied, "Then you'll be glad I saved the emails." The gasp that rippled across the table was louder than anything else that night. It was the kind of sound that told me I had shifted the ground under all of us. For the first time, I did not feel like the quiet one keeping the peace. I felt like the only one holding the receipts, and everyone in that room suddenly knew it. And that was just the beginning. The moment those words left my mouth and people realized I was not waving an empty threat, but pointing to something I could actually pull up and read out loud if pushed, the temperature in the room shifted in that quiet way you only notice when everyone else notices it too, because conversations at the far end of the table stalled mid-laugh, chairs scraped a little closer. And even the catering staff moved slower as if nobody wanted to clatter a plate while a family story was being rewritten. In real time. My mother leaned toward me with that brittle smile she uses when she thinks manners will win the battle. asking if I could help her in the kitchen for just a second, which in our house is code for stop talking and let me fix this the way I always fix things. And I told her I would be happy to help after we cleared one simple point that would calm everyone down because clarity, not cake, was the thing missing here. I turned back to my sister and asked if she could name the current board members with their roles, not because I wanted to quiz her or embarrass her in front of donors and relatives, but because if she could answer that cleanly, then this would be a misunderstanding that we could tidy up quickly and move on from without dragging the room through policy and procedure on a night meant for toasts. Hannah said she had a chair, a treasurer, and 2 at-large members who all supported her decisions, but when I asked for names she reached for a list that used to exist in a volunteer handbook we wrote together 2 years ago. And she began to say first names of friends who moved out of state or took new jobs that would have required a resignation, and she peppered that list with a cousin who once helped with a fundraiser and the neighbor who designed the logo, and it sounded less like a board and more like a memory of people who had been helpful once, which would have been fine if we were talking about a birthday committee, yet becomes a genuine problem when donors wrote checks expecting oversight. Mark, steady as ever, said he had reached out to the people Hannah referenced and that 2 of them politely confirmed they had not attended any meeting in over a year and a half. And one of them sincerely asked if the nonprofit was still active because she had assumed it folded during the pandemic after a long stretch of silence, which landed in the room with the unmistakable thud of a thing that cannot be spun into something else. I did not raise my voice or switch to a tone that invited a fight, because I wanted the people listening to see the difference between drama and documentation, so I explained that a board on paper does not count unless it meets, votes, records minutes, and signs off on significant spending, and I said that, while helping Hannah with last quarter's draft, I had searched for those minutes and found only a template that had not been filled in since the previous spring, which by itself could be chalked up to busyness, except the spending continued anyway, labeled as outreach and marketing in amounts that demanded real approvals. My mother whispered that this line of talk was humiliating and asked me if I understood how cruel it was to do this at an engagement party. And I told her I understood exactly how painful it felt, and that I also understood how painful it would be to the people in this room if they learned a month from now that they toasted over misused donations while someone who knew better stayed silent to keep the mood light. 2 donors were within arm's reach, and I looked at them without accusation, saying that every nonprofit makes mistakes and that fixing them quickly protects the mission as well as the people who give. And I asked Hannah if she had sent donor acknowledgement letters for the last round of gifts, because I noticed one letter that spelled a name wrong and reused the same paragraph 3 times with 2 different fonts, which is a small thing until you remember people save those letters for tax purposes and expect them to reflect care. She said the letters went out, and I said I believed her because I had seen the drafts, but I added that my concern was not the presence of letters, it was the absence of a vote authorizing expenses that seemed personal, and that distinction matters when real money is involved. While everyone sat in that strained quiet that follows a truth spoken clearly, I took out my phone and, without any flourish, drafted a very short, very polite message to the nonprofit's shared inbox that Hannah and I both had access to when we collaborated last year, and I wrote that, as a volunteer who had assisted with reports, I was formally requesting copies of board minutes for the last 12 months, along with receipts for any outreach or marketing expenses over a modest threshold, and then I added a single line that kept the tone professional by saying I appreciated timely transparency given the number of stakeholders present tonight. And I carbon copied the donors at the table who had already been told their gifts made a difference, so they would not learn tomorrow that silence had been the plan. My mother hissed my name like she could drag me back to childhood with it, and my father pressed his lips together and stared at the center of the table the way he does when he wants the moment to pass without asking him to choose a side, and Hannah told me I was making a scene, to which I replied that I was making a record, and there is a difference. I pressed send. The sound of that tiny whoosh might as well have been a gavel, because every person in that room understood that a request sent to a shared inbox leaves a trail and invites an answer that can be forwarded, filed, or ignored, and each option carries consequences. For a long breath, nobody moved. Then conversations restarted in low murmurs that kept failing to gain momentum because everyone was listening for the next sound, not from a microphone or a clinking glass, but from the devices on the table that had suddenly become part of this party whether anyone liked it or not. I set my phone down face up so no one could accuse me of sneaking or staging anything, and I reached for my water with two steady hands because I knew that whatever arrived next would set the tone for how hard we would have to push tomorrow. Mark's screen lit first, not mine, which would have been a small comedy under different circumstances, but here it felt like the room inhaled as one organism because he glanced at the notification, looked at me, looked at Hannah, and then held the phone slightly away from his body like it might burn him, and in a voice that carried without force he said, very carefully, that the shared inbox had replied already, and that the attachment did not come from my sister at all. When Mark said the reply had come in, and that it was not from Hannah but from the part-time admin who usually worked from her living room and occasionally from the coffee shop with the spotty Wi-Fi, the room leaned in without moving. And he explained that she thought the party was tomorrow and that, trying to be helpful, she had sent over a compressed folder with everything she could gather quickly so we would stop blowing up the inbox, her exact phrase in the subject line, which might have been funny on any other night and which now felt like the world's most dangerous courtesy because inside that folder sat a neat spreadsheet of outreach gifts, vendor reimbursements, and marketing items with delivery addresses and timestamps that were not vague or soft or open to interpretation. He held up the phone and asked whether I wanted to read it or whether he should, and I told him he should because he was the one who started the toast, and because I wanted Hannah to understand that this was not about me trying to steal a microphone. This was about facts walking into a room that had insisted for years that feelings should set the agenda while records waited outside with their coats on. Mark scrolled through line items and read them slowly, not to drag it out but to make sure no one could later claim they misheard, and he pointed to a series of purchases labeled as community engagement gifts, each one shipped to Hannah's apartment or to my parents' house with notes like, "Hold for Saturday brunch," or "Store safely until launch." And he showed everyone a boutique purchase that had been split into 3 receipt images and pasted into a single document titled Sponsorship Supplies. And he paused on a column labeled Scholarship Pilot where the disbursement address matched a rented mailbox at a parcel shop I recognized because I had once picked up a package there for her when she was out of town. My mother tried to say that sometimes small organizations need to use home addresses when storage is limited, and while that can be true in the most generous scenarios, the dates and amounts on those entries lined up exactly with weekends that featured photos of new outfits and salon visits, and the overlap was not subtle. I heard myself speak in that careful, level tone I use when I do project updates at work, and I said that if the entries were legitimate then we would easily match them to sign-in sheets, event photos, or thank you notes from partner organizations. And I added that one reason I had pressed for board minutes last quarter was because expenses above a certain threshold should be documented with a vote, especially when they involved gift cards or untraceable items that could wander away from the mission without anybody noticing until too late. Hannah told me to stop pretending I understood how hard she worked to keep the nonprofit visible, and I told her I did understand the pressure to look active in a world that rewards optics. But that pressure does not give anyone permission to treat donor trust like personal store credit, and if I sounded unsentimental it was because people in this room had written checks believing they were helping girls attend workshops and get mentorship, not fund. A version of professional sparkle that never makes it beyond the front row of a photo. Because I knew where this conversation would go next, I took a plain envelope out of my bag, nothing dramatic or theatrical, and I slid it across the table to Mark, telling him it contained the state filing receipt for the annual report that had been about to lapse, a filing I submitted last week after watching the deadline creep closer while hearing nothing back from Hannah except assurances that she would get to it. And I said that I did not take control away from her, I simply prevented a technical dissolution that would have made this mess harder to unwind, and the receipt timestamp could confirm that I acted before tonight and not as some revenge stunt that I conjured in the moment. He opened the envelope, looked at the stamped confirmation page with my name in the box for preparer, and said thank you in a tone that made it clear he recognized the value of doing boring things on time, the kind of quiet maintenance that keeps systems from collapsing. Then I told the room that I had also scheduled a compliance consultation for the next business morning with a pro bono clinic that specializes in nonprofit governance, and I said the appointment was not a threat or a show but a path. Because if the board could be reconstituted with independent members and the questionable expenses could be acknowledged and corrected, then the mission could be salvaged without turning this into a public flogging, and refunds or in-kind replacements could be managed with donor dignity intact, which is the only way a community grantmaker or employer match platform would even consider working with the organization again. My mother asked whether I had looped her in, and I told her she was copied on the calendar invite along with Hannah and Mark, and that the clinic would expect a good faith effort to present full records, not a performance that treated them like referees at a family game night. For a breath or two it felt like the wind had calmed, not because anything was resolved, but because the adults in the room could see a road they did not have to be dragged down, and then my father, who had been sitting with his hands folded like he was keeping himself from holding the table still, lifted his eyes and asked a question that changed the air again. A question so plain that every donor in the room understood the implications before he finished the sentence, because he said he remembered submitting an employer match form through his company after Hannah's winter fundraiser, and he asked whether any of the gifts in that spreadsheet had been paired with corporate matching funds. Since those programs audit randomly and require documentation that does not bend, and if matches were involved then this was no longer a family conversation, it was the kind of thing that knocks on doors beyond our control. When my father asked about employer matching funds, the tension that had already filled the room seemed to stretch even tighter. Because everyone present understood that once corporate dollars are involved, the situation moves from uncomfortable family dispute into the territory of formal audits and potential fraud investigations. And no amount of polite smiling or whispered pleas for peace can undo that level of exposure. Two donors who had been sitting quietly near the end of the table shifted in their seats, and one of them admitted that yes, she had submitted her donation through her company's matching program because she wanted to double the impact. And another added that he had done the same through his firm's community engagement initiative. The effect was immediate because these were not vague contributions or anonymous checks that could be blurred into the background. They were tracked, documented, and tied directly to payroll systems that companies defend with layers of compliance teams who do not care about family reputations or engagement parties, only whether money left their accounts for legitimate charitable purposes. Mark cleared his throat and, in a voice that was steadier than I would have managed under the circumstances, said he had already taken steps to protect those donors by flagging irregularities with the matching platforms, not to punish Hannah, but to prevent their employers from being misled. He explained that he had seen too many cases in his accounting work where employees got caught in the crossfire of nonprofit mismanagement, and he refused to let that happen to people he cared about. The room broke into whispers, some people admiring his integrity while others accused him with their eyes of disloyalty. And my mother finally lost her composure enough to say out loud that Mark had betrayed Hannah on the very night he was supposed to stand beside her. He did not raise his voice, but he met her glare and replied that betrayal was asking people to fund manicures and boutique clothes under the label of community outreach, and if anyone wanted to call that loyalty, then maybe the word had lost its meaning. I sat back and let the words sink in because I knew the force of his statement would carry further than anything I could add, but when Hannah tried to laugh it off and claim it was all being exaggerated, I leaned forward and said that exaggeration would be easy to prove wrong if she could show original program materials, attendance logs, or photos of beneficiaries using the gifts, and that my concern was not that receipts existed, but that they were mislabeled in a way that created a misleading picture of activity. I added that I had taken a closer look at the nonprofit's website earlier in the week and found that entire paragraphs of its mission statement and program descriptions had been copied directly from larger organizations, word for word. And while that might have been overlooked in a casual flyer, on a public site it was plagiarism that could destroy credibility the moment someone ran a quick search. To underline the point, I discreetly held up my phone and tapped a cousin into a FaceTime call, scrolling down the site and highlighting passages side by side with their original sources, and my cousin confirmed the duplication without embellishment. The murmurs grew louder, and my father rubbed his forehead like the weight of each revelation was pressing into him physically, but I kept my focus on the donors, because they were the ones who had the most to lose if this continued unchecked. And I told them that the safest path forward was to pause operations before the scandal grew legs, issue a notice acknowledging the need for review, and begin refunding or redirecting funds transparently. Then I took a folded sheet of paper from my folder, not a dramatic gesture but precise, and explained that I had already drafted a pause notice that could be posted on the nonprofit's website within minutes, along with instructions for donors to confirm how they wanted their contributions handled. I also held up another document, a letter to the state naming 3 independent community leaders who had already agreed to step in as interim board members if Hannah stepped aside, because they believed the mission was worth salvaging even if the current leadership had undermined it. Hannah snapped at me with a laugh that sounded sharp and hollow, asking if I really thought I could just take her nonprofit away from her, as if she were daring me to admit a hostile takeover. I looked at her evenly and told her I did not want her nonprofit. I wanted the truth to be on the record so that people's trust was not squandered in the name of family silence. The distinction mattered, and the donors heard it even if she pretended not to. Mark, who had been standing near his chair this whole time with the envelope of filings still in his hand, added one more line that cut through the noise more than anything else. He said there was something about the engagement itself that needed to be addressed before the night went any further, and that he could not keep it quiet any longer. The air froze again, and this time it was not about compliance or tax filings, but something more personal, because everyone realized at once that this was not only about the nonprofit anymore, it was about the foundation of the relationship being toasted. My mother tried to wave it off, begging him not to drag their private life into the spotlight, but he held firm, and with a look that showed he was tired of patching holes in silence, he promised that what he was about to say would explain why he had chosen tonight, in front of everyone, to bring everything into the open rather than waiting until it was too late. The silence that followed stretched so long you could hear someone's fork clink onto their plate at the far end of the table, and every eye stayed fixed on Mark as he prepared to speak. Mark stood there with the kind of heaviness in his expression that told everyone he was not bluffing or trying to dramatize the moment for effect, but that he was carrying something that had already weighed him down for too long. And when he finally spoke, the words came out measured and deliberate, because he wanted no one to later claim he had been rash or careless. He said that when he first noticed the financial discrepancies, he had not jumped to conclusions, and instead of accusing Hannah, he had suggested they go to counseling together. Not because he doubted her affection for him, but because he wanted to make sure they were building their future on honesty and not performance. He explained that she refused, that she dismissed the idea as overreaction, and that instead she pushed harder for an engagement party that looked bigger and shinier than they could afford. Because she wanted the photos to hit social media before anyone had a chance to question what was happening underneath. He paused, glanced down at the table, and then admitted that he had asked her to hold off on the engagement entirely until the nonprofit's accounts were clarified, but instead of slowing down she had booked a venue, drafted invitations, and told her parents that the event was non-negotiable, leaving him with the sinking realization that she valued the optics of commitment more than the substance of it. When he said he could not, in good conscience, go through with a marriage that began with deception, the noise in the room collapsed into a silence so sharp it felt like the air itself had been cut. He apologized to the guests, saying he knew they had come to celebrate, and he said he wished things had been different, but he would not tie himself legally and emotionally to someone who treated truth as optional. My mother pleaded with him to sit down and talk privately, reminding him that engagements are meant to be messy, that every couple has problems, and that nothing had to be decided in front of so many eyes. But he shook his head and repeated that lies have a way of multiplying when they are left unchecked, and that tonight was the line he refused to step over. My father sat down heavily, his hand gripping the edge of the chair as if the ground had shifted under him, and the entire evening's original purpose disintegrated into something unrecognizable. I took one long breath and knew this was the moment I had prepared for without even realizing how close it would come. I reached into my bag and pulled out a plain folder, nothing flashy, and set it on the table so that everyone could see it. Inside was a resignation letter for Hannah, drafted in clear terms that would preserve the nonprofit's mission while removing her as the face of it. A press note written in neutral language that framed the pause not as a scandal, but as a responsible step toward accountability, and a private list of donors willing to mentor young women directly until the organization could be stabilized. I said out loud that I was not here to destroy her, but to make sure that what people gave in trust was not wasted, and that if she signed the letter, the nonprofit could continue in some form without imploding. She scoffed, accusing me of plotting against her for months, but I pointed out that the filing with the state had been a safeguard. The compliance meeting had been scheduled as a lifeline, and the press draft had been my way of ensuring that the organization's name did not become synonymous with fraud in tomorrow's headlines. The people around the table leaned in, some nodding, some still holding back, but I did not give Hannah time to spin another excuse. I opened my laptop, connected to the venue's Wi-Fi, and showed that the nonprofit site was queued with the drafted pause notice. A simple message that read operations were on hold pending review and that donors would be contacted directly about refunds or redirection of funds. With the interim board members already lined up, I explained that control of the domain and administrative accounts could be transferred to a neutral party before midnight, ensuring that Hannah could not quietly alter or erase records once the room dispersed. My mother asked me, almost in a whisper, if I realized how harsh that sounded. And I answered calmly that harsh would have been allowing people to learn through an investigative article rather than hearing it now from someone who had cared enough to fix it before it reached that stage. Mark put his hand on the back of his chair, nodded slowly, and thanked me, not because he wanted to see Hannah humiliated, but because he recognized that the nonprofit might still survive if it had even one person willing to treat facts as immovable. Hannah glared at both of us, accusing me of wanting her life to collapse, but I told her clearly that her life was hers to repair, and all I was doing was preventing her mistakes from burying everyone else. My father looked at me with something between exhaustion and recognition, and for the first time in years, he said I had done the right thing. The room did not break into applause. It did not need to, because the shift in how people looked at me was enough to confirm that silence was no longer my assigned role. I clicked a button, and the pause notice went live. I forwarded the signed documents to the interim board and confirmed with the pro bono clinic that refund instructions would go out the next morning. It was not loud, it was not theatrical, but it was decisive. Hannah had a choice. She could face the consequences and eventually earn back trust, or she could walk away entirely. Either way, I had secured the mission, protected the donors, and removed the lie from the room. My mother stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. My father remained silent, but did not look away, and Mark placed the ring box on the table, unopened, as if to punctuate the night's final verdict. I stood up, collected my things, and told the room that I had not come to overshadow anyone. I had come to turn the lights on. And whether they liked what they saw or not, the shadows were gone.